The moment cash feels most comforting is often the moment I trust it least. It sits still while everything else shakes. It gives no warning. It lets me think I am protected because the number on the screen barely moves. Then one day, I realized the number survived, but my buying power did not. If you want to stay close to the patterns I have watched for decades, the ones that usually become obvious only after they have already done damage, keep this channel near you. What I'm about to lay out is not a market slogan. It is a pattern I have seen repeat in many forms, in many countries, under many leaders. And it almost always catches people at the exact moment they think they are finally being careful. I understand why people run to cash. When stocks fall, when headlines turn dark, when layoffs rise, when the future feels foggy, cash feels like a quiet room with a locked door. Nothing flashes red. Nothing swings by 5% before lunch. It feels like I have stepped out of danger. But I learned a long time ago that a stable price is not the same thing as a safe asset. Cash has one job that people love in hard times. It gives immediate control. I can spend it today. I can hold it without watching it move every second. That is useful. But useful and protective are not always the same thing. The hidden problem is simple. Cash is not wealth by itself. Cash is a claim on a currency. A currency is a promise made inside a system run by governments and central banks. When that system gets under pressure, especially from too much debt, the promise can stay in place while the value inside the promise quietly shrinks. That is why cash is so tricky. It usually does not fail with a loud crash. It fails with a slow leak. I still have my dollars. I still see the same account balance. But groceries cost more. Insurance costs more. Housing costs more. The trip I thought I could afford now costs much more than I planned. My money did not disappear. Its power did. Most people read this wrong because they judge cash in nominal terms. Nominal just means the number as written. If I have $100,000 and I still have $100,000 next year, my brain says nothing bad happened. But real value is what matters. Real value means what that money can still buy after inflation and after taxes. That is the game. So if my cash yields 4%, that sounds good. But if prices rise 4% too, I did not get richer. I just ran in place. And if I pay tax on that interest, I actually fell behind. That is one of the oldest tricks in finance. It feels like progress because the number goes up, but my standard of living does not. If you are looking at your own savings right now, what are you measuring as safety? Are you measuring the calm of the balance or the future buying power of that balance? I have found that this one question separates people who feel safe from people who are actually getting safer. I have watched this pattern become very clear whenever fear gets high and cash piles up. In the United States, money market funds, which are basically large parking lots for cash-like assets, push toward $8 trillion by early 2026. That is an enormous number. It tells me that people want yield, yes, but even more than that, they want emotional shelter. I never mock that instinct. I just know it can become a crowded trade. And crowded safety is often not real safety. When too many people hide in the same place, that place starts carrying new risk. The risk is not that cash vanishes tomorrow morning. The risk is that the system around cash changes faster than people expect. Rates change, inflation changes, policy changes, currency value changes, and most people notice only after their cost of living has already moved. I think about a simple case. I imagine someone who worked hard, sold part of a business, and moved $300,000 into cash after a rough year in the markets. That person feels smart and relieved. Maybe for a few months that feeling is justified, but then rent rises, food rises, medical costs rise, taxes take a share of the interest, and after 3 years the account still looks solid, while the life that account can support has clearly shrunk. That is a painful kind of loss because it does not feel like a loss while it is happening. There is no dramatic chart to scare me. There is no day when I wake up and see minus 20% in bright red. Instead, I slowly lower my expectations. I delay a purchase, I settle for less, I work longer. Quiet losses are often the most dangerous because the mind does not fight them soon enough. Now, I want to be fair. I am not against holding cash. I always think in terms of balance. Cash is useful for emergencies. Cash is useful for flexibility. Cash is useful when I need to meet near-term obligations. If I might need money soon, I do not want it swinging around in volatile assets. That part is common sense. But I do not confuse liquidity with safety. Liquidity means I can use the money right away. Safety means it will still do its job later. Those are different things. A glass of water is useful in a fire, but I would not build my whole house out of it. Cash is a tool. It is not a permanent shelter. The deeper reason this matters now comes back to debt. When debt levels get large enough, policymakers face ugly choices. In the United States, federal debt moved beyond $37 trillion and rose to well over 120% of GDP. GDP is the total size of the economy. So when debt is above 120% of GDP, the debt tower is very large relative to the nation's income. Then there is the interest bill. By fiscal 2025, federal net interest was nearing $1 trillion a year. That is not a side issue. That is a major pressure point, because when debt is this large, the system becomes very sensitive to interest rates. High rates may feel good to savers for a while, but they hurt borrowers, strain budgets, slow growth, and eventually create pressure for rates to come down. And when that pressure grows, governments and central banks usually do what they have almost always done in history. They try to ease the pain in ways that are politically easier than open default. They cut rates, they support credit, they run bigger deficits, they create more money and credit. They rarely come out and say they are weakening cash, but that is often the effect. There is a term for this. It is called financial repression. That sounds complex, but the idea is simple. The system keeps the return on cash and bonds below the rate of inflation for long enough that the real value of debt shrinks. In plain English, savers help pay the bill, not because anyone announces it proudly, but because the math leaves few painless options. If I only prepare for the market crash, but not for the policy response that comes after the crash, am I really prepared? That is the question I always come back to. The first move and the second move are often completely different. Cash can protect me in the first move, then the rescue comes, the currency gets diluted, and cash stops being the hero. History makes this very clear. In the Great Inflation, inflation in the United States rose from a little over 1% in 1964 to over 12% by 1974 and near 14.5% in 1980. That is not a small change. That is the kind of move that can rearrange a household, a retirement, even a social mood. People who thought in nominal terms felt less pain at first. People who thought in real terms saw what was happening. The lesson was not just that prices rose. The deeper lesson was that once inflation gets tied to policy, wages, expectations, energy shocks, and debt pressures, it becomes hard to contain without serious pain. Paul Volcker eventually crushed inflation with very high rates, but the debt load then was far lower than it is now. That matters. The medicine that worked in one era can be much harder to use in another. I have spent much of my life studying these debt cycles because they shape almost everything else. Booms feel private, but the busts are public. Everyone says they want sound money, disciplined budgets, and honest pricing. Then the pressure hits. Jobs are at risk. Banks are stressed. Elections get close. And all at once, leaders prefer a little more liquidity, a little more borrowing, a little more dilution. This is why the simple line I used years ago, that cash is trash, was not really about insulting cash. It was about warning people not to treat cash as a long-term store of wealth in an environment where central banks had pushed rates near zero and were creating huge amounts of money. Later, when rates rose, cash became tactically better. Tactically means good for a period of time. But tactical usefulness is not the same as strategic protection. That distinction matters a lot. I can like cash for 6 months and dislike it for 6 years. I can hold cash while uncertainty is rising and still believe cash will fail as a long-term protector once the policy cycle turns. People get confused because they want one answer that lasts forever. Markets do not work that way. The same asset can be wise in one phase and dangerous in the next. The big mistake is thinking the yield on cash tells the whole story. It does not. A 4 or 5% cash yield can feel very smart when markets look expensive and growth is soft. I understand that. But if the world slips into weaker growth with sticky inflation, that yield is not enough. Sticky inflation means inflation that does not fall back down easily. In that world, cash gives comfort while my costs keep climbing, and the institutions that live closest to this problem do not ignore it. Central banks around the world have been heavy buyers of gold for years. After record buying in recent years, they still added hundreds of tons in 2025. I pay attention to that. Gold has no yield, but it also is not someone else's promise to pay. When official institutions want less exposure to paper claims, that tells me something about trust. I am not saying gold is perfect, and I am not saying everyone should rush into it. I am saying I watch behavior more than words. Governments talk about stability. Central banks talk about control, but balance sheets tell the truth. When reserve managers diversify quietly, when investors crowd into cash, when debt service rises, and when policymakers still need growth, I know I am looking at a system under long-term pressure. I have seen versions of this in many countries. The names change, the flags change, the speed changes, but the pattern is familiar. People pile into the local currency because recent pain taught them to fear volatility. Then the answer to the debt problem arrives through devaluation, inflation, or both. The people who felt prudent discover that they were standing still in a room that was slowly filling with water. The United States has more room than most countries because the dollar is the world's main reserve currency. That is real power. It lets the country borrow more for longer and at lower cost than most others. But that privilege does not cancel arithmetic. It only stretches time. And stretched time can be dangerous because it lets comfort grow deep roots. That is why I often say the system matters more than the headline. A news story may tell me that inflation cooled this month, or that markets expect rate cuts, or that growth is slowing, or that stocks are shaky. All of that matters. But underneath it, I ask a simpler question. Who owes what to whom in what currency, and how can that debt be managed without breaking the system? Once I ask that question, cash starts to look less simple. If the debt burden is heavy, then somebody has to absorb it. I can tax people directly. I can cut spending. I can restructure debt, or I can lower the real value of money. That last path is usually the least obvious and often the most politically tempting, which means the person holding too much cash may be volunteering to absorb part of the adjustment. If this is changing how you think about risk, stay with me, because the most costly part is still ahead. The danger is not just that cash loses value. The danger is that cash trains the mind to mistake stillness for safety. And once that habit forms, I stop asking the harder questions at exactly the wrong time. Human psychology makes this worse. I feel volatility instantly. A falling stock bothers me today. Inflation bothers me slowly. It shows up in bills, in fees, in small changes to daily life. My brain reacts more strongly to sharp, visible pain than to slow, hidden erosion. That is why I can watch my account sit flat and feel calm, even while my future standard of living is quietly being marked down. I have learned to respect that bias in myself. That is one reason I do not build portfolios around comfort. I build them around scenarios. I ask what happens if growth slows. I ask what happens if inflation stays too high. I ask what happens if policymakers print more than investors expect. And I ask what happens if I am early, which in markets can feel a lot like being wrong. So what could happen next? One path is a soft landing. Growth slows, inflation cools enough, and rates come down gradually. In that case, cash does fine for a while, but over time, productive assets, meaning good businesses and other real stores of value, likely do better. Cash would have served as a bridge, not a destination. A second path is stickier inflation with slower growth. That is a harder mix. In that case, policymakers want to ease, but inflation does not fully cooperate. Cash yields may look decent, but real returns get squeezed again. Gold, commodities, and businesses with pricing power may hold up better. Pricing power means they can raise prices without losing all their customers. In that world, cash feels safe right up to the point it begins falling behind. A third path is a sharper downturn. At first, cash could look brilliant. Risk assets fall. People feel foolish for having taken too much risk. Then the response comes. Bigger deficits, easier money, lower real rates, maybe direct support of some kind. And suddenly, the asset that won in the panic starts losing ground in the recovery and inflation phase. I have seen that movie more than once. So when someone tells me cash is finally safe because it pays yield again, I understand the appeal, but I do not stop there. I want to know why that yield exists. I want to know how long it can last. I want to know what debt pressures are building underneath it. And I want to know what policymakers will do when those pressures collide with politics. What am I missing in my own portfolio if I hold cash mainly because it helps me sleep? That question has saved me more than once. Sleep matters, peace matters, but comfort can become expensive if it replaces clear thinking. I never want calm feelings to do the job of hard analysis. My answer is not to abandon cash. My answer is to size it properly. I keep enough cash and short-term safe instruments for needs, for flexibility, and for opportunities. But I do not ask cash to do a job it cannot do well over long periods in a debt-heavy world. I do not ask it to be both liquid and a reliable long-term store of purchasing power. That is too much to ask. Beyond that, I think in balance. I want some assets that do well in growth. I want some that do better in inflation. I want some that hold up in deflation, which is falling prices and weaker demand. I want resilience, not a single bet. The future is not one road. It is a set of possible roads. Good investing is less about knowing the exact road and more about surviving the roads that surprise me. That means I think about diversification very seriously. Diversification just means not depending on one thing to save me. It can include quality businesses, some inflation-sensitive assets, some gold, some foreign exposure, and some cash. The mix is not the same for everyone. Age matters, income needs matter, risk tolerance matters, but the principle holds across almost all cases. If I know I will need money in the next year or two, cash makes sense. If I know I will not need it for 5 or 10 years, holding too much in cash can be a quiet form of self-harm. That sounds harsh, but I have seen how many people lose not through stupidity, but through false definitions of safety. They protect the statement and expose the future. And that, to me, is the heart of the title. Cash feels safe right before it stops protecting me because the human mind loves stability and the policy system loves hidden adjustments. Put those two together, and I get one of the most common traps in finance. I hide in the asset that moves the least, right as the value of money itself becomes the thing that is moving. So I come back to a very plain rule. I respect cash, I use cash, I never worship cash. When fear rises, I ask whether I am buying real protection or just buying relief from watching prices move. Those are not the same purchase. One protects capital, the other protects feelings. I have learned that the market can take money fast, but the monetary system can take it slowly and with a smile. And slow losses are the ones people forgive until they can no longer afford to. That is why I watch debt, policy, and purchasing power more than I watch the comforting stillness of a cash balance. In the end, real safety is not the absence of movement. Real safety is the ability of my wealth to keep doing its job in the world I actually live in. Cash is often a useful pause. It is rarely a permanent answer. The most dangerous thing about cash is that it can look safe all the way down.